What is that? A combination gun sword cane? The blade and kind of the overall profile almost reminds me a little bit of a Chinese gem. It has the end of a walking stick. So, walking stick plus wheel lock gun. Yeah. Gentleman's refined self-defense. A number of rapiers and parrying daggers. And what I think you would find particularly interesting is sword catchers up there. And yes, I say catcher rather than breaker. It might be possible to break a fairly thin rapier blade. I doubt that was the primary idea. It's really mainly to trap the blade and control, which of course is what that spring-loaded parrying dagger does as well, up on the left there. So there's a button that you push that brings these out, otherwise they fold in and form a blade. The one on the right there does that as well. That parrying dagger in the middle there is massive. The blade itself is fairly thin, but then the teeth are large, so that you make sure that you do damage to the opponent's blade rather than your own. I've seen some tests done with one that's more like this, but doing that with the beefier one up there would be quite interesting. I could see maybe at least some rapier blades you might be able to break with that. It's a Dusak, and that one stands out because of the serrations. These ones are fairly rounded in shape overall, but they're still sharpened in the valleys in between there. It's got a shell guard. And interestingly, much like you would sharpen the back, the false edge, to be able to use that, they did that here too. Quite a unique piece. And then the other one next to it has a plain edge. The open work on the grip there is very interesting. You can actually see the tang through it. I'm not sure if you can in the video, but you're just gonna have to take my word for it. You get so much variation in this time frame. There's some sorts that defy classification, basically, or are just one of a kind. Like this. I mean, have you seen this sort of guard before where you have two hooks coming up? Also a very unique pommel shape. This is just unusual in just about every way. And a combination weapon up there. A basket-hilted sword with a wheel hook. When you can't decide if you want to stab or shoot them, why not both, right? The blade actually slides down into the haft. Wow, that is also something that you don't normally see. Extendable spear, sword, staff, whatever you want to call it. They got very creative. There are plenty of sort of experimental designs, I would call them. Sometimes it was a matter of the makers basically showing off the craftsmanship, like, oh, look what I can make. Not necessarily always intended to be used all that much or at all. In some cases, they definitely were intended as such, but not always. Sometimes it was really just a prestige piece, a gift to a ruler perhaps, or some other influential person. That's always a possibility. Doesn't quite look like in fantasy, but every now and then you do find spiked shields. Probably ceremonial. There's a lot going on. It's beautiful, decorative, but not necessarily the most durable. Although the haft is perfectly usable. There's nothing wrong with that. But it does make me think a little bit of some fantasy designs where they just go a little bit overboard with the decorative elements, and then you have areas like this where if you have, they're stress risers basically, and if you have any kind of impact shock, that can lead to trouble. It could break right there. During a procession, that's not an issue. That's a rather unusual one over here. Crescent-shaped blade. I would guess probably processional rather than for actual use. That's a little bit too delicate. Whether you want to call it greatsword or simply two-handed sword, true two-handed sword, there's a lot of different potential terms you could use. Zweihander, which just means two-hander. With these, it often becomes difficult to tell whether they were meant for use or, again, bearing swords. This one, if I had to take a guess, I would probably say bearing sword, because it's awfully large. It has some additional pieces that add more weight without really doing a whole lot. In the Indo-Persian section here, there's something very strange. So there is an axe right there. If you saw just a picture, you might not bat an eye at it, but the thing is tiny, strangely small. I don't know what the purpose is. If it's ceremonial, I know this is always this avoidance answer. I can't really imagine it's a child's toy, although they had certainly different ideas about safety around children back then. So who knows? It does look like it could theoretically be used. It looks solid. I don't really have a way of showing you because I can't get my hand close enough. When it's in the foreground, you can't tell. But the handle looks like it might even be thinner than my pinky finger. So it would be difficult to hold on to, really. Imagine pretty much a pen. Also, hand shock. I think if you actually hit something with it, that would hurt the hand. And there are what I would call war picks. Very nice work on that. If you look at the central ridge on that one, has some decorative elements. The haft as well. There's a lot to look at in general. And the unique thing about that spiked mace is that it has essentially a sword hilt. In fact, the axe does too. So that's something that you don't normally see elsewhere. So we have a shamshir with a wavy blade. Yeah, it looks like it's watered steel. Cameras are awfully light hungry. So even though I can see perfectly well, the camera basically pretends it's half blind at this point. But it's as close as I can get to it. So maybe you can just about tell. It's interesting that it has this undulating shape even on the spine. Normally, I expect that on a double-edged blade. Was that functional? Was that the idea? It's always hard to say, but I would think it could come in handy in a fight, just in the sense that you can bind a little bit better. So when you displace an opponent's cut with a false edge, for example, you might be able to get a bit more purchase on it that way. There's a serrated one. I have to show you that one. That's crazy. These are the kinds of serrations that you usually only see either on modern knives or fantasy weapons. This is quite something. Those are very large serrations. No, those are sharpened, in fact. You can see. What's the point of that? Well, that's always the question. It could have been for functional purposes, but the problem I see with that is always I very much expect serrations like this to stop the cut short because they get caught on things, whether it be clothing or bone or who knows what. I wouldn't expect them to cut all that well. However, sometimes the idea might have just been to make them look particularly menacing. I wouldn't want to be hit with that. Obviously, I wouldn't want to be cut with any sword or weapon in general, but there's something extra vicious looking about this. There is a pata or sword gauntlet. This one, as they tend to be, is quite long. And so these are actually European longsword blades that they imported into India and mounted as a sword gauntlet. Westerners are not the only ones who find objects from other places interesting as curiosities and everything. Just like katars, these were intended for hunting. Which is good to know because you can just as easily, out of context, think this is for dueling or battlefield use because then the hand protection would be relevant, right? Whereas in hunting, well, I suppose it's relevant too. And what on earth even is that up there? It's an Indian throwing star? Maybe that's what it looks like. I have no idea what that is. It's hard to find information about this, but apparently the bottom piece is a shield that covers a perpendicular handle. Even weirder, this version has blades that can be rotated for some reason. That's just bizarre, and the handle looks extremely awkward to use. I highly doubt that it ever was used in actual fighting, but who knows. It was also featured in the 2016 Assassin's Creed movie. Personally, I think as a large throwing star without the handle and shield, it would be more effective. What even is that? A double corkscrew spear? That looks particularly painful. It looks like it could be used, but it could very well be processional. Sometimes it's hard to say. I mean, a lot of processional weapons are obvious as such, but sometimes, yeah, this, for example, as well, this two-pronged spear with wavy blades could have been used as a weapon, could have been processional. I'm leaning more towards actual weapon because the tips are reinforced. There's really no reason to do that if you're not going to use it. So, and that right there is quite unique. A twin-bladed guitar with dual sheath as well. It's always debatable how much difference that makes. I mean, obviously it makes a difference, but essentially you have probably relatively similar mass compared to one broader blade. It might just be a little bit more. So it should handle fairly similarly. So now you stab two areas at once. It also means twice the chance to hit bone or other materials that stop the thrust. But, you know, it may look fantasy, but in this case, I don't actually think that's a bad idea necessarily. These I would bet money on are processional, these lion-headed clubs. And there we've got, what's it called again? A madu, I think. Which is these two horns covered by essentially a small buckler. These actually have metal points as well. Sometimes it's just the horns. Sometimes they are reinforced like that. There's plenty more extra footage for patrons and members, and I want to thank everyone for their support. It really helps.